So tonight we're going to talk about the pattern book. Jessica is going to do that, but there's a first, my typical survey questions. There are a couple questions for specific speakers that we haven't had a chance to get answered, and so I'm sorry to those of you who asked a question for Drew or for Ian. There was a question about what our goals were for the People's Planning Academy, and then kind of what's next, how can you keep being involved in planning? And so on the screen are the three kind of objectives that we shared on our first class about what we were trying to get out of it. As far as what's next, you will be invited when we send you your diploma, and so your diploma will be mailed to you, so make sure that Jane has your mailing address before you leave. But included in your diploma will be an invitation to join the stakeholder committee for the Marion County Land Use Plan update, which will take place starting early in January next year. And so that's one way that you can stay involved. That's the immediate kind of way to stay involved. We will also be sending you a final survey about the entire academy and your experience here and kind of how you see it working or evolving in the future. We hope to keep this going somehow, some form, some fashion. And so that might give us some ideas on how to keep you guys involved in planning discussions going forward. There's a question about statistics on students where everyone's from, and we didn't have your address until Jane asked for it to mail your diploma, and so now that we have those, we can actually start mapping that. I will say that when we did the pre-registration before we launched the Eventbrite system, we actually did map out people's addresses, and we went out to neighborhoods that didn't look like we had a lot of people in those areas, and we targeted next door invitations to the Mayor's Neighborhood Advocates, and we also hand-delivered flyers to community centers and libraries in those areas. And so we did try to get geographic distribution, but we'll see when we actually map all of your addresses to see if we succeeded in that. And then there's a final question about urban core neighborhoods that were in decline and success stories about how we kind of use the existing footprint to turn it around. And I'll tell you that every single neighborhood is unique. Neighborhoods are social creatures. They're made up of people, and because every one of you is unique, every neighborhood's unique, and the circumstances are unique. And so without going, that's probably a whole nother class in the next People's Planning Academy about how that happens, but I will kind of highlight 5 key themes about what I see as far as the neighborhoods that in Indianapolis that have kind of bottomed out and bounced back. The first one is available land or available homes. And so you think about Fall Creek Place or St. Clair Place, neighborhoods like that, there was a significant amount of vacant land, abandoned homes, things like that. And so you could see transformative change happen. There's also the ability to be flexible to adapt. And so if you think of Sobro, south of Broad Ripple, that's a neighborhood that does not have really big houses. They're very, mostly 2-bedroom type of homes. But it had that industrial corridor along the Monon. And so as that stuff has evolved and come back to be more mixed use and commercial and things like that, it's been able to remain vibrant, kind of bounce back. Another thing is proximity to market success. And so Fall Creek Place worked because it was on the one-way pairs into downtown. And so all the commuters coming in to downtown saw that. And downtown was becoming big. The same with St. Clair Place, the same with Fountain Square, even the same with Sobro, the strength of Meridian Kessler and Broad Ripple. Housing stock is incredibly important, and we talked about how housing stock is very slow to evolve, and so we build it for today's preferences, but that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be preferred in the future. And so we do have lots of neighborhoods that don't have the larger housing stock that a lot of people require or demand today. And so places where we can either build new housing stock, there's a huge demand for new urban product, a new house in a walkable urban neighborhood, or places where we have some historic homes or some bigger homes. That seems to help as well. Reinvestment in walkable infrastructure. We talked about the importance of walkability as trends and demands change. So the places that had infrastructure, or we could reinvest in it, that's been a common theme. And then oftentimes the key ingredient is there's some cheerleader. And that's either a community development corporation or some other neighborhood advocate that can really be the cheerleader, the owner, kind of make the project happen. And so those are some key ingredients. That doesn't mean that every single success story we've had in Indy or nationwide has all of those pieces. And it doesn't mean that there aren't other ingredients, but those, I think, just quickly are some of the 5 themes that I see. So that's survey. And so previously in People's Planning Academy, planning is law, or planning is a guideline to inform zoning decisions. It's the budget. The built environment improves or dictates our health more than our zip code. Places have to adapt as climate, as people, as society, as everything changes so that they continue to thrive. We talked about building places for all peoples, or all ages, all incomes. We talked about some of the dark side of planning and how we need to be cognizant of the decisions that we're making today and some of the either intended or unintended consequences that they might have. Last week, we all loved Drew's presentation about kind of how Indianapolis has grown recently, and that's by absorbing people moving out of the rural and small town Indiana. And what happens when that pipeline of talent starts drying up and we have to start competing regionally and nationally for people to live in our neighborhoods. And then we had Abby Holman and Ian Nicolini kind of talk about the economic business side of our community, including how each type of development has different markets that it requires, and those markets are largely tied, for better or worse, to income and density or some combination of those. And so before I move on to tonight's topic, are there any questions? I think we'll have some time at the end today to have open question and answer time. But if there are any questions before we move on to tonight's content? All right, seeing none, we have one speaker tonight, and that is Jessica Thorpe, our principal planner for land use strategy, and she's going to go over the pattern book.
All right, you guys have made it through a whole lot of information. I know Brad already said thank you, but I just wanted to extend my personal thanks for coming out and participating in this kind of first go of the People's Planning Academy. I know we've mentioned this kind of over the past few weeks, but this is something we will be looking to kind of continue on. We're not sure what that looks like yet, but we'll make sure that you all are aware of kind of our plans moving forward with that. So, we've talked a lot about a lot of different concepts over the past few weeks. We've learned how to make Indy healthier, more resilient, more inclusive, and more competitive. And we've talked about how each of these 4 goals from the bicentennial agenda relates to land use. But your role with us, as Brad mentioned, doesn't end today. You're not getting off that easy. So today we're going to talk about how, why you were all here to begin with, and how the Marion County Land Use Plan and the Pattern Book, how you folks are going to be playing a role in mapping that out moving forward as you get invited to participate on the stakeholder committee. So today is really going to be a training to teach you how to use that Pattern Book effectively. So, you'll be helping us implement the Pattern Book by mapping out all the different typologies or neighborhood types that it outlines. So this is really your opportunity to influence what the land use plan recommends for your community. This is a really, really cool opportunity to have sort of intimate involvement in that planning process. And I know a lot of you have already read the Pattern Book. We've gotten a ton of feedback from you all, from Civic Comment, that website that we sent you all previously. We got over 150 comments that we've incorporated into the plan, so that's pretty cool, and I just wanted to thank you all for your involvement there. And then before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, I'm just going to briefly recap kind of the big picture of what the plan is and how it fits into our system, because I know it's been a few weeks since we talked about that. So what is the land use plan and why does it matter? The land use plan, as Brad mentioned, is the bridge between the bicentennial agenda and all of the development that happens in Indianapolis and goes through a zoning process. So it's what translates the vision and values of the agenda to guide those decisions. So it's got a few different steps, and there are a few different ways that the land use plan can play a role. So typically when we see zoning petitions, it's because a property owner has submitted a petition because they needed to either rezone their property or get a variance for it. Now we don't have a lot of control over how the land use plan is used before this point, but ideally the land use plan played a role in site selection for that developer. Maybe they have a really organized neighborhood group with a land use committee that has been using the plan to kind of aid in discussions with that developer before it even gets to us. That's pretty common in some of our more active neighborhoods. The next step is for the city to review that petition and to make a recommendation. So the land use plan is one of the things that they refer to when they are writing those recommendations. And then there's a public hearing. And at the public hearing, the community has the right to voice their support or opposition for that. And the land use plan can be a really great tool for communities to build those arguments. We're actually working on developing a workshop that will actually teach people kind of a citizen's guide to remonstration, if you will, to teach folks how to use the pattern book to support or oppose zoning cases in their neighborhood and help them to actually, I guess, teach them to use it to build strong arguments. And then finally, the Metropolitan Development Commission, if it's a rezoning, or the BZA, if it is a variance, makes a decision. And the land use plan is one of the things that they are required to look at when they vote on those cases. So I wanted to clear up some of the kind of confusions about limitations of the plan. There were a few things that came up in the comments on the pattern book on civic comment that I just wanted to clear up. So the land use plan, while it starts to get into form and urban design a little bit more than our previous land use plans, it's also kind of important to understand what its limitations are in relation to zoning. So the role of the plan is to provide guidance and to inform the zoning process, but it's not intended to contradict the zoning ordinance. So you'll see in the pattern book more policy statements. So things like development should be supportive of pedestrian activity. It's not going to get into the nuts and bolts of, the zoning ordinance actually states that if there's a cul-de-sac, there should be, in certain situations, there should be pedestrian connections to the nearest adjacent street with a sidewalk, and it gets into a lot more of those specifics than the pattern book does. So the land use plan doesn't regulate, for example, the specific number of parking spaces a development needs. It doesn't say exactly how tall buildings should be or how much open space development should have. Again, it makes those policy statements kind of those guiding principles rather than the exact specifics. So kind of starting to get into the pattern book portion of the plan. Remember, the plan has two elements, the map and the pattern book. The pattern book is really all about context. So at its highest level, it's about how uses relate to their neighborhood. It provides guidance on where uses should actually go within neighborhoods. So it talks about connections to infrastructure. So should a use be on a local or an arterial street? And it also talks about proximity. So things like, schools we know shouldn't be near interstates because of the health hazards of pollution. And we know that houses should be near parks and things like that. So it talks about, locating uses based on these different factors. And then the next level, it talks about how buildings relate to each other. So this is things like connectivity and character and massing. So for example, we know that big institutional buildings, such as hospitals, shouldn't turn their backs to neighborhoods. So you don't want to see a row of houses that are looking at a 4-story blank wall with no windows, or a large parking lot or something like that. In many cases, the pattern book even recommends that parking lots should be internal or behind the development to promote walkability and to kind of maintain the rhythm of buildings on the block. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it talks about how buildings should relate to people and how buildings should encourage how people relate to each other. So it talks about, how buildings should be activated at grade. So they should have, if it's a mixed-use building, it should have retail on the first floor. So it has those active uses promoting pedestrian activity, externalized front doors on residential buildings, and things like that. So the pattern book has a few different types of geographies that it uses to establish kind of how to map its recommendations. So the first is typologies, and we've talked a little bit about those, but those provide guidance on what uses might be appropriate based on the context of a neighborhood area. So it categorizes different neighborhoods into these different typologies, and then each one of those has a list of recommended uses within it. And then those uses have conditions applied to them that provide more specifics on where they should go exactly. So in the previous land use plans have gone parcel by parcel. This is looking at kind of a little bit bigger of a scale to provide more flexibility and adaptability as neighborhoods grow and change. And then it also has overlays. So those are used in places where the land uses that are allowed in a typology need to be adjusted. So they will add or remove or modify these uses, usually based on special circumstances, such as an environmentally sensitive area, or maybe an area that we think is ideal for transit-oriented development, things like that. So it kind of lays over top of the typologies. And then finally, we have standalone uses also. And those are the uses that really have to be mapped individually, things like really large-scale parks or cemeteries. These are mapped individually kind of based on their scale or the nature of their use. It even includes special uses such as the state fairgrounds, the motor speedway. Think about those uses that they need specific consideration because of their kind of uniqueness. So I'm going to go over each of the different typology categories, and then I'll give you guys some time to really look through. You have the typology section. It's the excerpt from the pattern book in your packet that you should have picked up on your way in. So I'm not going to go over each one. I'm going to give you some time to scan through those, but I did want to go over just the kind of 3 buckets that they fall into. So the first is living typologies, and those are primarily residential. So those have some neighborhood serving uses mixed in, but they're mostly, such as shops and schools, but they're mostly homes. Homes are really the priority in these areas. And then the more intense uses, such as the retail, are organized around busier streets and intersections and things like that. But again, the focus is really on the housing in these districts, or in these typologies. Then we have mixed-use typologies, and those are more of an equal balance between those residential and non-residential uses. So they're a little more split in places where people live and places where people work. They still have those homes and neighborhood serving uses, but they start to introduce things like regionally serving uses, maybe a grocery store or a larger school, and then as well as working places such as offices and institutions. And just like in the living typologies, the more intense uses have conditions that minimize the impact of factors such as traffic on the homes. And then finally, we have working typologies. And these are primarily non-residential areas, places where people work. So generally, they're intended for uses that are too intense to be near homes. So think about things like business parks, industrial areas, regional commercial areas, or large-scale office parks. Those would all be examples of uses that would fit into these typologies. And then I'm going to run through the overlays really quickly. So as I mentioned before, these are used in places where land uses that are recommended in a typology need to be adjusted. So the environmentally sensitive overlay is intended for areas containing high-quality woodlands, wetlands, or other natural resources that should be protected. Transit-oriented development overlays promote pedestrian connectivity and increase density and intensity of use around transit stations. Town center overlays are for new and historic urban centers. So they're similar to the transit-oriented development overlays, but not necessarily just for areas that are transit served. They're really oriented around making those really pedestrian-friendly, walkable Main Street type places. Then we have the residential corridor reserve overlay. This is used to protect key residential corridors from encroachment from other uses. So for example, Meridian Kessler, they implemented an early version of this system in their neighborhood plan, and they used the residential corridor reserve overlay for the sections of College Avenue between the commercial nodes. So they really saw that maintaining that kind of neighborhood character of the street was really critical to them, but they still wanted to have those commercial uses at the intersections, and so they simply put that residential corridor reserve overlay in between them to kind of demarcate where those different uses should go. And then we have the industrial reserve overlay, and this is intended for areas that we think are prime for industrial development. So for instance, a very large parcel that's near the interstate without any incompatible uses around it might be a good candidate for this. And the idea behind this is to keep large parcels from getting broken up because they're a lot harder to reassemble and to develop once that's happened. We have the airport vicinity overlay, which promotes development that appropriately responds to the unique needs of airports. This isn't necessarily to protect neighborhoods from noise or nuisance of airports. That's really kind of a mapping issue on what base typologies are appropriate in those areas, but it might mean allowing for commercial parking or hotels in a typology that wouldn't normally recommend those uses. And then finally, we have the critical area overlay, and this is basically for all those special circumstances that aren't covered in the other overlays. So every time a new critical area is mapped, a custom set of recommendations for that area will be written. So as I said, I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to kind of skim through the summaries of the different typologies that you have there in front of you. You'll have 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes to answer any questions when you're finished. Okay, so before I move on, does anyone have any questions about the things they were reading about? We'll have time for questions in the end as well. But, yeah.
What's the difference between an arterial street and a collector street?
So those streets are actually designated in our thoroughfare plan. I don't know that plan super well, but I will refer you to that. You can go to indy.gov/DMD and find our adopted plans under the long-range planning section. The thoroughfare plan. Yep, Brad might be able to answer that question. Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, what's the difference between an arterial and a collector street? So, sorry, I don't know that.
So an arterial street is what planners call busy roads. And so you think Keystone, Meridian Street, Washington Street. Collector streets collect traffic out of neighborhoods and dump them onto arterials. And so it's kind of that middle level street. And then there are specific, I'm not a transportation planner either, Meredith's not here, but in layperson's language, arterials are major streets, collectors are more smaller neighborhood streets, and then local streets is what we call what most people live on.
But each street is actually given a designation, so those come from the thoroughfare plan. Okay, yeah.
How do they determine the density per acre?
So the question is, how did we determine the density per acre? So that was based on conversations with our Keith Holdsworth and a lot of our other planning staff that have been involved in a lot of the different land use plan updates in the past. So it's basically, typologizing our existing neighborhoods and looking at kind of what's been appropriate there in the past, and just kind of looking at our previous land use plan systems and trying to figure out how to group those uses together into these typologies. Yeah.
Could you repeat where you find the thoroughfare?
Yeah, indy.gov/DMD. And if you look under the long-range planning tab, you will find a link called Adopted Plans, and that will bring you to all of our adopted long-range plans. Yep. In the back?
Okay, I'm not clear as to whether your pattern book is used to create zoning ordinances or to make zoning decisions.
Great, so the land use plan it provides guidance on zoning decisions. So when we've had this question a couple of times, when the land use map is updated and when the pattern book is updated, when those things get adopted, they won't actually change the zoning. They will not change zoning regulations. What they do change is what gets looked at when those decisions are made. So the pattern book and the land use plan map are things that get referenced when decision makers are making kind of those determinations. Yeah, I've got two back here. Oh, got a few.
Go ahead.
In the middle there. Yeah.
Is there a reason why there isn't a specific in your typologies designation? You only mentioned it once under town centers about historic areas, and why there is not a separate designation for that?
Yeah, so those, I'll refer you to when we get new historic districts implemented, they each have their own individual plan that is made for those areas. So the historic preservation plans kind of run adjacent to the land use plan system. So they each have their own unique plan that gets referenced when those decisions are made. So the Historic Preservation Commission has a very similar process to MDC and BZA, but they refer to their own plans, not to this one.
So are they both considered when they're talking about rezoning specifically?
Yeah, so I think that the historic preservation plans are definitely kind of the first place they look, but they get information from a lot of different places. Back here in the pink. So right now the land use plan uses what are called critical areas. So we've implemented that here as well, but there's every critical area has its own specific set of recommendations. So when we developed the overlays, we basically looked at all of the different critical areas that we had in the land use plan in the past and found that a lot of them were very similar. So those are where our overlay system comes from. And then we left that critical area one in there so we can kind of catch all those outliers. Then you in the front had a question.
In reading through these typologies, I know this is going with the land use plan recommendation things. Is there going to be something in there correlating the typographies with the zoning levels? Because in reading some of these, like office industrial mixed, that what I'm reading is like an I1. the light industrial reads kind of like an I-2 and the heavy industrial an I-3. So is there going to be anything helping to correlate between the two different areas?
Yeah, so the question is, are we providing any guidance that correlates actual zoning districts with the recommendations? Some of our plans in the past have done that, have gone that specific, and most of them have not. And we, after talking with current planning, the team, we have decided not to make that direct correlation at this time. Depending on lots of circumstances, a zoning district may or may not be appropriate. Oftentimes when rezonings come in, there's commitments or variances attached to them. And so by limiting it to specific districts, it might remove the ability to be a little more flexible with another zoning district that has some of those variances and commitments attached to it. And so clearly, context is very important to the land use plan, and so in some of the commercial districts, there's more of a one-for-one trade, and so light industrial is more of the 1 or 2 industrial districts. Heavy industrial is more of the 3 or 4, right? But for some of the other districts, it's more context, what's around it, and we're simply providing the high-level guidance about what we'd like to see.
Well, the reason why I was asking is, some of us have been involved in this for quite a while. And with these new descriptions, those that are coming in there's a zoning issue or something coming up, going by what is on the current zoning map versus what's recommended might be confusing to some individuals if they don't get involved.
Yes, and that's true. We have struggled with confusion between what planning is and what zoning is. That's one of the entire reasons we have all of you here tonight, is to help improve that. But yes, that confusion still remains when you've got 2 maps and people don't understand what each map means. That's a struggle that we will continue to have, and we'll continue to provide educational opportunities. We actually will be producing a series of videos about the pattern book and how to use it in the coming months.
So I also just wanted to clarify that these summaries are not the only kind of guidance for these typologies. Each typology has a whole chapter with the list of recommended uses and the conditions that tell you when those are appropriate. And we're going to get into that now. So you also will find in your packet an excerpt from the typologies chapter. Or I guess it's in the packet that you have open there, but a few pages in. So at the beginning of each typology section, you'll find a summary. So you should have the suburban neighborhood one with you. And this summary is exactly what you just read. It's just kind of put in this spot also. But then after that, sorry, let me back up. So this summary gives you a quick description of how that typology looks and feels, what its general massing and layout and density are like. But it's it's intended to provide just kind of a picture of what that typology is like overall, kind of what its typical features are. But not every area that's mapped with those typologies will fit perfectly into that mold, and that's kind of one of the things you've pointed out. So the next section talks about what uses are kind of recommended within that typology. So you'll see that section after the summary, and these uses also include conditions. So you'll see that the assisted living facilities are recommended in the suburban neighborhood typology, and you'll see the conditions that are underneath that say that that's true as long as they're located along an arterial or collector street, and as long as they aren't within 1,000 feet of a highway. It's also recommended that they screen their parking and service areas to make them fit in better with surrounding neighborhoods. And then you'll notice that each condition has one of these little bubbles next to it. These tell you which section of the rationale chapter you should refer to if you'd like to know more about the purpose for that condition. So for instance, you'll see that the bubble tied to the highway condition under assisted living facilities refers to healthy section 4.1, and that's referring to the section in the other packet that you have with you. That's the planning rationale chapter of the pattern book, and each one of these bubbles ties to a section of that planning rationale. So in healthy section, Make Indy Healthy section 4.1, you'll see that the document talks about how vulnerable populations should be separated from highways because they're a major source of air pollution. And so each one of the conditions in the pattern book then explains the planning rationale behind it. with that little bubble. So you can use it to flip back and forth. This is when I talk about how we'll be teaching you how to, in maybe a future workshop, teaching you how to use this document to build strong arguments, either in support or opposition in cases. This will be a really valuable tool for you all because you'll be able to see the specific reason for our recommendations. In the past, some of our land use plans don't include any explanation for why things were colored certain ways. And so we've run into this problem where if no one's around that was involved with the creation of that plan, we don't actually know what the rationale was behind those decisions. And so this is kind of a valuable tool for everyone to have to be able to kind of see that directly through the pattern book. Is there a question?
I'm going to say ask. So this will allow residents or community organizations to go into the office and remonstrate or before a development project and be arguing if our goals are separate of what the staff's recommendations are. So this will help in that argument. Is that what you're saying?
So I guess what I'm saying is that the land use plan and the pattern book they're definitely a tool for current planners and for the folks that make recommendations to MDC and to the BZA, but they're also incredibly valuable tools to our communities. And so the layout of this pattern book is intended to kind of communicate the rationale behind each of its recommendations so that anyone who's building an argument, whether for or against a case, can really use it to develop kind of that argument and kind of lay that out. Does that make sense? Okay, so then towards the end of each typology section, you'll find the recommendations for overlays. For each overlay, you'll find a summary that explains its purpose, and then under that, you'll find the uses that are affected by it. And like I said before, the overlays either add, remove, or modify uses to the base typology. So you'll see that while assisted living facilities are generally recommended in the suburban neighborhood typology, they aren't recommended if that area falls into a residential corridor reserve overlay. And then each of those will also be tied to an explanation from the planning rationale chapter. So I'm going to run you guys through some examples. We're going to put your new knowledge to the test. We're going to do this one together so we can kind of work out the kinks in using this pattern book. So imagine that you work for the city and you've been asked to make a recommendation on a zoning request. So you all have a map with you, so that lays out each of the different sites that these exercises reference. So say a developer wants to build a big box store on site 4. The question is that an appropriate use for that location? And also, is there any other information that you might need to request from that developer before you can finalize your recommendation? So take a moment to look through the community commercial typology. You'll see that site 4 falls into community commercial. Just look through that for a second. So you'll see under large-scale offices, retailing, and personal or professional services, which is the use that this would fall into, it lays out the conditions for that use. So it's along an arterial street, so you're good there. You'll see the streets are also labeled on your map there. If it's adjacent to a living district, you'll see that you'll want to make sure it won't have any outdoor display of merchandise. You'll also want to make sure that it has sidewalk connectivity to residential development. So the developer will need to build sidewalks, but is there anything for those sidewalks to actually connect to? And you also want to ask them how big is it. So it shouldn't have more than 125,000 square feet of floor space. So I'm going to let you guys do this on your own. So imagine that you're a developer looking to build a large-scale apartment building. You have the choice of any of the sites on the map. So take a moment to determine which site you should select, and I'll give you about 3 minutes to look through those. All right, has anyone picked a site for their apartment building yet? Yeah. So you picked 1 or 5. So for site 1, it was definitely appropriate as long as you had at least 15 units per acre. That one was in the TOD overlay, so we recommended a little bit higher density in that typology. And 5 is also good because it's on an arterial, so you saw that on the map. Good. Anyone else? Yeah.
2?
Yeah, so site 2, we preferred mixed use for that site, but it's appropriate there as well. It was also appropriate on site 8 because it was on a collector. If you looked at site 3 or 4, you'll notice that those were not allowed in the community commercial typology. And 6, 7, and 9 were not appropriate because they were not on a street that could handle the traffic from that size of development. All right, so one more exercise. This is your last one. You're going to do this one with your tables, so I encourage discussion on this. I want you guys to pick the best site for a duplex, a small-scale park, and a daycare, and then find the best use for sites 1, 3, and 7. So these can overlap. You don't have to try to fit them all on the map at the same time. And you'll have about 10 minutes for that, and Brad and I will be walking around to answer any questions you might have.
All right, so what do you guys think? Where do you put the duplex?
8 or 2?
Site 2? And why'd you do that?
Because it calls for attached housing in that area also. It's allowed.
I'm just trying to do the microphone.
Because the attached housing is allowed in that typographical area, and in 8 also because of the streets, the arterial streets and the collector streets, they could be set on the corners. So you have a corner here with an arterial street, 2 arterial streets in 2 that it could be put on, and also down here at 8 where there's 2 collector streets on the corner.
Okay, good. And so if I was in the business of building duplexes for sale or for rent, then you've helped me locate 2 places where the land use plan says that'd be a good place for them, right? Okay. What about site 1? And so on the other hand, say you're a property owner and you own site 1 and you want to figure out what the land use plan might allow. Did anyone get to that piece? What did you build on site 1? Mixed use? Everyone build mixed use? You didn't get that far. Chris, what do you build?
Library.
Library. Offices, affordable housing. Okay. Churches. Okay. So you kind of get the idea of how this works. So whether you're approaching it from you have a use and you want to figure out where the land use plan says it might be a good place to put, that's kind of the first column. And the second column is you have a piece of property and you want to know what might be allowed there, right? Or what might be recommended, right? And so that's how the pattern book works. You have an excerpt of it. The full pattern book, if you do join the stakeholder committee, you will receive a full copy of it. The full copy has definitions of it. And so if you're wondering what we call a daycare in planner language, with a small-scale school or neighborhood serving institution. And so the full pattern book will have a chapter on definitions to explain some things like that. So that's kind of the end of the pattern book session. And so I'm going to open it up for broad-scale, far-ranging questions soon. But are there any questions about how you use the pattern book? Chris?
It's more a question about whether you will illustrate the word pictures with both good and bad examples. That's the case, say, in the regional center plan. And most people that I know find the pictures way more helpful than the words.
Yeah.
Yes, and so the question is, will we illustrate? And yes. The pattern book will evolve. And if you've been involved in our planning process before, we do a plan and it's 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30 years before we come back and change it. That will not be the case with the pattern book. By moving the entire county into a single system, that allows us to keep up the system much more frequently. And so we actually intend on amending things in both graphic enhancements like that, as well as some content changes if we learn things could be done better. And so this version 2.0, Jess has a version 2.0 checklist on her desk, but that will have graphic illustrations about the types of places we're picturing and some more diagrams and some things like that. So yes, it will dramatically improve in readability. And the gentleman over here mentioned it might be good to have cross-reference on uses. And so you can see, if you've got a use, you can see what typology it might be recommended in and make it easier that way too. Any other pattern book comments or questions?
You're kind of discussing, are there any thoughts or plans on making like theater programs that can help, have this quickly?
If you've seen our technology, the question was, could we make a computer program that kind of makes this a little easier for you? And that's something that we honestly haven't thought about right now. We've been focused on getting the content right, but that certainly would be something that could be beneficial. So you could pick out a use and it'd show you where you could do it, or you could pick out a property and it would highlight what you could do. Yeah, so I could see that down the road. We are working, speaking of technology, we are working on the planning portal, which will be a JS application by which you access all of our plans. And so right now, if you want to know what land use recommendation is for your property, you have to know what plan it falls within. And how you know that is by you open up a list of 40 PDFs to figure out what you're in. And so that will be all on a map. You'll be able to click on a piece of property. It will tell you what the recommendation is. It will tell you the base typology, the overlay. It will tell you the thoroughfare plan recommendation. It will tell you if there's a bike plan or greenway plan for your property. It will also daylight some where the TIFs are and some of our other economic districts that right now aren't really easy to find. And so that is coming online, hopefully by the end of the year.
You just answered my question.
All right.
What are tips?
TIFs are tax increment financing, and they are extremely controversial and a course unto themselves, but they are a way that we finance public infrastructure and economic development in certain places of Marion County. All right, so I think, are there any other pattern book questions before we move into the general final 30 minutes with Brad question session?
When the tips come up, when that does come about online, will that be something that you will include us in?
Yes, and certainly. And so when the planning portal debuts, we can make sure that all of you are some of the first people to get a look at it. All right, ma'am.
If there's a contradiction in the current use of land and the recommendation, is there work to move towards getting it back to the recommendation?
So the question is, if there's a discrepancy between the current use and the recommended use, how do we kind of get closer to the recommended use? And again, the plan comes out when a change is requested. And so if there's a, let's say there's a gas station, let's not use gas stations, too controversial. Let's say there's an old Kmart, right? And the plan recommends that that should be an office park instead because of its proximity to interstate or transit or something. If Walmart wanted to come in and reopen that Kmart as a different type of store, they don't need permission because it's already zoned to do that. And so the plan doesn't really help. Where it would help is if someone wants to come in and do something different, whether it's they want to put in an industrial park or they want to put in an office park. If someone wanted to come in and change that Kmart zoning, then the plan would say, well, actually, we don't want that to be an industrial park. We prefer that to be an office park. And so you start getting it aligned with the plan through that way. But again, it's really only when the plan comes out, and that's when someone needs to change what's, or they want to do something different than what's already allowed. Other pattern book questions? Ma'am.
Does the pattern book have designated where there are vacant properties now? Is that part of the, I mean, there's not anything really addressing that, but so say there's a vacant shopping strip or a vacant industrial park or manufacturing or whatever. Is that included in what is currently on the map?
So those are included as far as they are uses. And so whether a commercial property is vacant or used, if we say it should be recommended to be a commercial, that's kind of the extent of what the plan is involved in. I wish I had the power to plan out vacancy of all kinds, but that's just not something that the plan can do. And so it's more about, think about the use rather than actually the ownership or anything like that.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of somebody coming and wanting a different use for a building and it's sitting there vacant as opposed to building something new or taking a look at, you know, what is in the metropolitan area and what vacant, you know, what vacant tracts can be repurposed.
So I can take this a couple ways, but if someone wants to come into an existing vacant building and do something different, the plan may or may not be consulted depending on what the existing zoning is right now. Now, can the plan say we have too much regional commercial around, we don't want to build any new regional commercial and we want to force you to occupy existing stuff? I wish we could do that. That's a step some states and communities allow. There are places out west that have growth boundaries, and that's sort of what you're talking about, where you can't develop new land until all the existing land is full. That is not something that the pattern book does right now. Sir?
Do you see the revision of the pattern book in 5, 10, 15?
So the revision of the pattern book is going to be as needed. It's not going to be 5, 10, 15 years. It's going to be more, I would anticipate an annual or even more than that. It depends, it's a new system. And so as we deploy it through the mapping phase next year, I expect that we will learn some things, and we are committed to evolving it and changing it as we learn things. And so it's not a point in time done deal. We expect that it will evolve quite frequently. And things change, and so drone landing spaces are needed all of a sudden because we don't shop at Macy's and JCPenney's anymore. And we need to accommodate that in a plan. That's a way for us to do this without having to go back and amend 50 different neighborhood plans. We can do it in one system and it's automatically reflected. And so it allows us to much more easily keep our plans up to date. Sir?
So we saw today in the news that workers are getting priced out of Hamilton County. And that happens a lot when you have specific dwelling units per acre, you know, like 1 to 5 in suburban. Then it becomes sometimes it becomes like economic segregation. So how do you fight that? And then the second part of that question would be, can you put incrementalism into land use plans?
So yeah, the question was, in Hamilton County, workers are basically being priced out of some neighborhoods, and when you regulate by very slim density levels, you're basically setting the price point of a home, and so you don't have the mix and you don't have people that can grow in a neighborhood. And so that was one of the reasons we've talked about the competitiveness and we've talked about the inclusion, because the way that we plan neighborhoods can inhibit people living there or can allow them living there. And so I used the example a time or two ago about Meridian Kessler and how you had the mansions on Meridian Street, you had the managers living on the interior streets, but then you had small worker cottages on the numbered streets, and once you got to College where we had transit, you had mixed use and apartments and things like that. And so you had one neighborhood that allowed whoever you were able to find a place to live in there and kind of grow in the same neighborhood. And so now, for the most part, because we regulate by very narrow bands of density, we end up with signs that say houses from the 200s or from the 400s and things like that. And so a very specific type of person can live there. And so you'll see in the pattern book that we are getting away from that narrow band. We're kind of widening the band a little bit and widening the different types of housing that are allowed. We still put a lot of conditions on where different types of housing can go, so we don't end up with dense apartments in the middle of neighborhoods with streets that can't handle them. But we're more talking about kind of the broader district scale. And so neighborhoods, people belong in neighborhoods where they live in a house or a duplex or a townhome or an apartment. Doesn't mean that all of those should go on every street, but it says in this broader neighborhood, that's the type of environment we want to create. And so we are trying our best to do that. I can tell you that it's, some people love it and some people don't. But that's kind of the intent of that, is to get it, reducing that narrow band of opportunity. Sir?
Brad, you mentioned that there would be a new plan website that would show the maps once they're generated. Will that be laid over MapIndy, or will zoning also be included on the planning map?
So MapIndy is the base of it. MapIndy is evolving through a thing called ShiftIndy, which I can't do a great job of explaining, but it's the brand new digital city hall website system that we're building. So we will be one of the first into the new platform, but it is integrated into the MapIndy system. The same people who build that and operate that build our system too. Marisol.
Can you talk a little bit about the certified neighborhood plan pilot program?
All right, so the question about certified neighborhood plans, and we're in a pilot program right now for those. And so certified plans is an idea for us in city government to recognize plans that we don't prepare, that you all prepare or other people prepare. And as our capacity has reduced, as nonprofit capacity, as planning, my profession, has become very democratized, there's more and more tools out there to allow people just like you to do neighborhood planning. And so I need a way to recognize that so I can embed it into our system that matters to the Metropolitan Development Commission and the Board of Zoning Appeals. Because right now, when you do a plan of your own, a quality of life plan or some other neighborhood scale plan, that's not one of the 5 things that the state says we look at. And so I want to find a way to empower those plans that you are all working on and have them have meaning into our system so we can support them. And so the certified plan process is essentially a set of criteria about how you do those plans and how you engage in them, or how you engage your neighbors in them, and so that we can trust them. I can't have a neighborhood coming to me with 5 different plans by 5 different factions, which can happen in some of our neighborhoods. And so so we've put up some criteria to make sure that everyone's involved and I can trust that what's coming to us is a legitimate voice of the community. And if it is, and it meets our criteria, we'll put our stamp of approval on it. It will go into the planning portal. And so when developers come in and want to know what they can do on their property, we can point them to here's what the official city plan, but here's also what the neighborhood has said. And then we will take the recommendations from your plans as far as land use and transportation and actually consider them, embedding them directly into our plans. And so there's a direct pipeline to our process. So we have 3 neighborhoods going through that pilot right now. I hope that we can unveil that. We've got one completed that's come back to us. I hope that we can unveil a countywide opportunity to do that early next year. And so part of the reason for this program is to give you some of that planning expertise so that you can engage your neighbors and talk about some of the issues that we think are important for us to see in neighborhood plans.
Can you say which of the communities that are doing that?
Sure. So the Southside Quality of Life Plan is a full-fledged LISC-sponsored quality of life plan. There's staff support and everything behind that. And so that's one type of plan that we have. We've got a lot of those. We have the Holy Cross Neighborhood Plan, which is a grassroots group of neighbors coming together to update a very antiquated city plan. And so that's one. And then the Valley Vision Plan is the plan for the Valley neighborhood around just south of the GM stamping plant. And that's kind of a hybrid. It's Community Development Corporation led plan, but it has had some professional support with it. And so those 3 plans, we're going to see how they come in. We're going to see how our criteria works. We're going to see what we ask for proof, if that's hard or easy, and then tweak the criteria and then hopefully roll it out countywide.
Holy Cross?
Yes, Holy Cross. Holy Cross is just northeast of Angie's List. If you know Angie's List at Washington and I-65. Yep. All right.
So I was thinking, are mixed-use plans that fit in there? Are any correct?
Talk to me afterwards.
Okay.
Special situation. Sir.
So the Near West Collaborative, we have a quality of life plan. It's pretty comprehensive. We also, as River West Great Places in Near West, we also have a design guideline for the River West corridor. There's a lot of time and effort put into this. It's backed by LISC, our CDC, IUPUI. So we have a whole slew of organizations that have dedicated a lot of time to these. How do we take our quality of life plan and our design guidelines and where do we submit those?
You talk to Jess and I. So just wait for us to get our final criteria. We will allow some recent things to go retroactive, but we will still ask you to basically prove that you have followed or would have followed the criteria that we're looking for. Any other comments about planning? Questions about the city? We've got about 10 minutes left. Sorry, I missed you. Sorry.
I mentioned at the first Saturday session, are you looking at all at golf courses? And the reason I said that is because there's probably going to be around 200 golf courses over the state of Indiana that are estimated to close operations in the next 5 to 10 years. Those are going to be beautiful pieces of property. And if people just chop them up or grab them and any number of things could be built on them, it seems like you would want to look at those in Marion County, at least to put them on your plan. And I didn't notice on any plan where that, it's not even listed as a park.
Yeah, and so the question was golf courses in particular. We've got a surplus of them. Golf is trending down in its audience, and it'll probably trend up at some point in the future. But and there are lots of uses where we've got too many of them. Regional commercial is one of those things. We also have too much of that. And so how do we consider that? And so Saddlebrook, anyone from the Saddlebrook neighborhood here? Jane. So Saddlebrook, their golf course, it's a golf course community on 56th Street. Their golf course went bankrupt and went to sheriff's sale. And so they obviously panicked about what was going to happen to their golf course. And they're actually fundraising still right now to subsidize a golf course operation. From a city perspective, the Riverside Park Master Plan was just adopted by the Board of Parks, and that proposes removing 2 of the 3 golf courses we have in Riverside Park and repurposing them to other more different types of recreation. And so we do have a glut of those. And so we don't have land use category for golf courses. And part of planning is understanding what our role is and what the market's role is. And so I don't expect that many new golf courses will come online anytime soon. And so,
Not new ones, but you're going to end up with some land that maybe you could acquire.
right, and so redevelopment, and then, oftentimes, in the case of Saddlebrook, the golf course was part of their stormwater retention system for their neighborhood, and so it was hard to extract out that master planned community. It's hard to extract out the heart of that to do something different with. And so, I don't have a good answer for that. I will tell you there's some interesting models out west that instead of golf courses, you have urban farms sort of as the thing that generates value for the adjacent neighborhoods. And so that might be an interesting adaptation, is instead of building your community around a golf course, you can build it around a working farm that then provides revenue for the community facilities, the HOA pools and things like that. So, all right, ma'am.
What's up with the airport? Like the old airport site, the old terminal, all the parking lots, the hotels that were there. Like, what's going to happen with that?
So what's up with the airport? That's an airport question.
I mean, it could be light industrial, heavy industrial. Like, is that where Amazon's going to go in our fantasy?
So, I mean, the airport is an extremely unique use, right? And so we don't want to piecemeal away airport property that has runway access, right? If you want runway access in the state of Indiana, there's very few places you can get in. Our airport's one of them. And so we want to make sure that we are taking the highest and best advantage of that amenity there. And so the old terminal property in particular has direct runway access. And so that's something that, the airport's being very choosy about using. Now, some of the property that's on Washington Street, where they had to buy out some homes for noise mitigation issues as the airport expanded, that is actually being actively marketed for industrial uses. And so you'll probably see some of that coming online soon.
Go back to the Riverside plan.
Yes, back to the Riverside plan.
Yes, Is that established, I mean, that's determined right now? I mean, that plan is actually.
So the Riverside Park Master Plan was about a year planning process that Parks engaged in. There was a significant amount of public outreach. There was significant concern about, as the park could see improvements, displacement happening as people are attracted to that, and so that was a big part of the conversation. I witnessed some of that conversation, or involved in some of that conversation. But the Park Master Plan was adopted by the Board of Parks a week or two ago, and it will go to the Metropolitan Development Commission for a comprehensive plan amendment in the coming weeks. But I think riversideparkplan.org.com might be the website where you can actually go see what's proposed.
Do you know the park, could you tell us which golf courses are gone?
So there's some consolidation happening, but the golf course on the east side of the river, I don't know the names. The east side of the river basically becomes recreation, active recreation. The northwest, so across from where Heron High School Riverside campus will be, that will be kind of an outdoor wetland, environmental eco area. Okay. I'm not going to quote because I don't know my golf. I'm not a golfer. But the east side, the east bank of the river of Riverside Park will be all recreation uses. Riverside Park, by the way, is bigger than Central Park. Random trivia.
Yeah. Does Riverside Park, the master plan, and I didn't know anything about this because I'm actually not in that neighborhood, but historically, and I just know this from my tour business, was the land was originally set aside by Tiger, which the memorial is in Riverside Park, and I don't know where that renovation is. Are the facets of his plan, are they still in effect, or has that disappeared, and is that why this new Riverside master plan has come into play? Because I thought that was still in effect.
So it's still in effect, and the Taggart Memorial is certainly something that a lot of people have worked a lot of time to figure out how to restore. It's kind of embarrassing that it's fenced off and falling down, but that is actually envisioned to be part of an outdoor amphitheater kind of event venue with waterfront access and some things like that. And so the historic plans evolve, and so the new plan pays honor to some of that history. It also pays honor to some of the historical residents of the neighborhood. There's a luminary walk that's proposed that talks about some of the success stories that have come out of the Riverside neighborhood. But it also looks forward. Parks change, and if you were here for Andre Dinman's presentation, the demands that people have for parks now and what we're doing with parks have changed dramatically. And so the more types of activities, the more uses we can add, the more active they are, the safer they are, everything like that. So riversideparkplan.org.com, something like that is the project website if you want to take a look at what is being proposed for Riverside Park. Any other comments or questions? All right, well, on behalf of our entire team, Jess and Jane, I want to thank you for your participation. I hope this has been as rewarding for you as it has been for us. The workbooks, we'll have some survey questions about what you thought about the workbooks and how valuable those were. But if you haven't, you can finish working that up or reading that up. Also, again, we will be mailing your diplomas. And so if Jane does not have your address, she's in the back and we'll take it. Those diplomas will be coming in the coming weeks, and they will be signed by Mayor Hogsett. So again, thank you. Have a safe drive, safe ride home.